everyone, and welcome to the Dyslexia Life Hacks Show. I'm your host, Matthew Head, and in this episode, I'm talking to Professor Roxanne Varzi. She's a writer, artist, filmmaker, playwright, dyslexia ally, and full professor of anthropology and film and media studies at the University of California, Irvine. She's also published award-winning books, which she has many of. She now has a new Whodunit book, which is one of my favorite genres, which is the first in the Armchair Anthropology series. As always, I'll put links to her books and other things we talk about in the show notes, which will be available at dyslexialifehacks.com/podcast. Welcome to the show, Roxanne.
Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. There's lots and lots we can talk about, but I thought one of the things we get started on really is your interest in anthropology before we get into the dyslexia stuff. So where did the sort of seed for that come from?
Wow. I've always wanted to be a writer, and I knew that I wouldn't be able to afford to be a writer.
Okay.
Something practical. So I decided to get a PhD in comparative literature. So that was like the closest thing. And I realized I didn't want to spend a career analyzing, deconstructing, and destroying literature.
Oh,
And that I was more interested in humans. And I thought, what would be an interesting way to prepare myself as a novelist and still get a PhD so that I can teach and earn a living? And I thought anthropology. And I just took a couple of anthropology classes and I liked them, but not until grad school. I only did one anthropology class as an undergrad, and it was a total turnoff. They showed a film of frat boys swallowing salamanders to talk about ritual, and I thought, ugh. I dropped the class the next day.
Yeah.
Actually, that's not true. I did one anthropology class because unlike you, I was horrible at math. I think I also had dyscalculia.
Okay.
And so I convinced my guidance counselor to let me take poverty and culture as an economics course. And I loved it. I interviewed homeless men in DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., and hung out with them for a couple of days. And I just really enjoyed talking to people, and I preferred, now I realize that's kind of a dyslexia trait. I preferred getting information by chatting with people and observing, and, that's what a lot of anthropology is about. And I did it naturally, and I loved that. So that was kind of the beginning.
Oh, I see. And where does film and media tie into this then? Because when I read the three, I was like, hey, how does this all work together?
It's again, I guess I'm all over the place. I'm very visual. I went into Iran and started doing field work, and I've always been attracted to film and cinema and independent films. And I enjoy that as a medium for storytelling. And when I went to do my field work in Iran as an anthropologist, I wrote into the proposal that I was going to take video because I was working on propaganda and how the government creates a nation state through visual arts. And I thought, I can't do that without showing it. And I think even in my writing, I'm just incredibly visual. And it was funny because when my son got diagnosed and we found out that it's hereditary and that there's this huge visual component to dyslexia, I thought, well, it's definitely my husband because he's a sculptor. And then it didn't occur to me that I do so much visual work, and I think visually and I write visually. So I think it feels totally natural to me.
So is that where you found out you were dyslexic, is through your son's diagnosis and initially
Yes.
trying to point it towards your husband? And is he dyslexic too, or is he?
He is. We're both equally dyslexic. So my son turns out to be severely dyslexic, and you take two moderately dyslexic people and you put them together. Up with the severely dyslexic, but also incredibly, visual. He has all the strengths as well. So, yeah.
Is that one of the moments where he's going through the diagnosis and you hear things that he's doing? You're like, oh, I do that. And your husband's like, me too. Well, it's got
Absolutely. Well, he's also extremely verbal. So he and I are very verbal people. We like to talk, we like to write, we like to read. We're really into literature. Just extremely verbal, very bad at math. And it was, by the age of 3, he was trying desperately to read. And I actually probably have stealth dyslexia because I more or less taught myself to read, kind of like Agatha Christie. I was an early reader. So it went under the radar for years. Terrible speller. I have other issues like word retrieval, which I can tell you about even now. Um, but so we got him tested pretty early because he was so frustrated, and we realized that there was something else going on. And he and I are both into poetry, and I thought, well, if you can rhyme, then you must not be dyslexic, so it's not that.
Right. Okay.
But then I started looking at things, and I thought, I think it might be that, and maybe we should get him tested. And now I know that I think my father was definitely dyslexic.
Ah,
And he was
okay.
also really visual. He always had a camera with him. He loved taking photographs. He ended up being a librarian, so also really into words, but
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
more like sat around and talked to the students in the library, rather than actually reading a book. I was writing poetry on the sly, very musical, but got through life because he was in Iran and from a very literate, kind of moderately wealthy family where he didn't really, he didn't suffer as much because he just
Ah.
kind of glide through. Though he did, I think it was difficult for him in different ways. But so I can definitely see the family line and the characteristics.
Is that something you delved into when obviously you found out you're dyslexic, you found out your son is, and then considering what you majored in and what you study, you're like, hang on, let's go and pull the rest of the lines in and see what goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I delved right in to the point where I was on one of the IEP meetings, where we do the individual education plan, which is just the most
Mm.
traumatic. And I ended up doing a ton of research so that I could go in there like, armed.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter. You can know way more about these folks about dyslexia, and it doesn't matter. You need a sheriff to come in and like tell them to change things.
Oh,
I
I
mean, it's just like
see.
it's so, but it was funny because then I advocated for my nephew, who's also dyslexic in Washington, D.C. And the psychologist was like, Dr. Varzi, so where did you get your neurology PhD? And I was like, oh, actually, I don't have a PhD in neurology. And he was like, really? I was like, nope. So I went full force into, because it was so interesting to me to figure out how the
Yeah.
brain worked, and having 3 people with dyslexia in the same family and having it be so very different in all 3 of us was also kind of
Mm.
fascinating to my anthropological brain.
I can imagine.
My husband's more like you. He's the engineer. He can, he's a sculptor also, and he can look at something and go like this and like know exactly like the measurement. And I can look at something and say, wait, was that inches or feet? Or I'm so bad at numbers. And that's my son, you know. So yeah. But then my son hyperverbal, and my husband's not so interested in reading books. So yeah, it's been
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, it's funny, isn't it? How you can compare all three under the same household, and particularly with your sort of background and looking into things. But I wonder whether you looked back and, like we were saying, the anthropology, filmmaking, and media feels like they're all over the place. But one of the strengths of a dyslexic mind is being able to bolt that sort of stuff together. So do you think, looking back, like, that's what I was doing. That's why I thought, hey, these things would tie together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And now I teach multimodal anthropology, and I've also made sound projects,
Yeah.
and I've done murder mystery and fiction, poetry. And it kind of drives my colleagues a little bit crazy. They want to categorize you, and they want to put you in a genre, and they want to, they don't want you all over the place, which is really too bad. Um, I think academia is the last frontier where we're still not figuring out that we need to do this. But yeah, I think it was really liberating, especially the last few years over the pandemic when I was Zooming with folks, especially in England, and meeting a lot of people who, are my age, who have dyslexia and are out in the world doing their thing. And I realized like, oh yeah, this is where the multidisciplinarity comes from. This is where like seeing all these patterns and feeling to me like it makes complete sense, and other people not getting this is where it comes from. And now I'm not as mired in the struggle And which really helps. I am also able to articulate to students that this is a strength and that this is a good thing, and I'm able to articulate it more to my colleagues that this is something like we need to teach differently. We need to be able to bring in projects. We need people to engage differently. And this is why I wrote the murder mystery. I want to introduce anthropology in a way that I think is a lot more, not just, I don't want to use the word easy because I don't think it's easy necessarily, but just different than we usually do.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And looking back, and did you start once you got the sort of diagnosis, so to speak? Did you change anything in your life to kind of make things easier, simpler, or what did the switch did it flip in your mind? I suppose.
I guess, I think my diagnosis wasn't, I think, as, I think it was important, but I think it was with my son and going through all the advocacy and all of that. I mean, I realized that a lot of places where I had been
Mm.
bullied might have been because of some of that. But I think it was really learning how to advocate for my son that taught me to
Oh,
advocate
okay.
for myself, and also taught me that it's okay to, I mean, okay, now I'm telling you this from a place where I've already published in the academic world. I've done all the peer reviewed stuff. I became a full professor, but I finally decided that it was okay not to have to go through all those gatekeepers, and it was okay not to just kind of go my own way. So one of the things I learned, especially talking to people like Chris Arnold, who encouraged me to just create my own imprint, for example, because I was handed a really bad contract for my book, for my murder mystery. And I was telling him, I don't want to sign away all my serial rights. I don't want to do this. And he said, well, why aren't you just doing it yourself? And that was something that was really empowering, was to talk to people with dyslexia who are in other fields where you do those things on your own, or you do kind of break out um, and kind of forge a different path. All this entrepreneurship that people talk about that dyslexic people have, or people with dyslexia have. I never thought about it in terms of like, oh, I can actually have my own imprints, or maybe being an entrepreneur in that sense is just doing a murder mystery that doesn't fit into any genre, and therefore it's not going to be picked up by a trade press because they can't put it on a particular shelf in the bookstore. So I just do it myself. And so I think that was one of the gifts as an adult, was looking at
Yeah.
people like Richard Branson or Chris Arnold, or just people who were kind of doing their own thing, and realizing that there are many ways to do your own thing, even though I think I've been boxed into this academic world for such a long time. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
Did you make any changes to the academic world from the inside out as well?
yeah, and I've been doing that all along. Like I said, and I think it's been really hard because I've had to fight all along to kind of justify. And I think the world is finally catching up and realizing that there are many different ways to teach. There are many different ways to output research. Now it's something that people want to hear more about, and people want me to come and talk to them about, like, how do you output research that's scientific and sound? Or how do you do it in poetry, or
Mm.
how do you do it differently so that it engages somebody who may not want to read a boring scientific monograph, you know? And I've been saying this, I use the climate science as an example all the time. Climate scientists are incredibly important right now, but if they're just putting their stuff
Yes.
out in peer-reviewed journal articles, it's not going to have a huge effect. So how do we put that out in a way that makes sense to people on a daily basis who are out there, feeling the heat? How do we do that? Through a play, through a Netflix special? I don't know, like,
Yeah.
so we have to think of different ways of getting information out there. And I think it's just something that I've always thought was important. And I also struggled in graduate school. I didn't tell anyone, but I had such a hard time. I was at Columbia University in New York City, which is already, like, already a little bit competitive, in these seminars, with 12 other grad students. And we're reading a book a week for each seminar, and we're taking 3 or 4 seminars semester.
Oh,
And these books, they're not like written in, they're not written in beautiful prose. Right? So no
no,
offense. There
no.
are some anthropologists, I just want to say there are some really great anthropologists who write well, but not all of them do. And not all of it was anthropology, because we were reading all over the place, philosophy, and I couldn't do it. So I'm very good at picking up threads of conversation and adding to it and figuring out what's going on and putting the pieces together and being able to enter into that conversation without having read any of the work. So I couldn't get through the reading. I didn't do most of the reading. I didn't.
Did you have any good hacks for how you got around doing the reading? I've got some good ones, but
Yeah, I'd love to hear yours. Well, I just would listen to people and they would inevitably basically, parrot what was in the reading, and then I would pick up on what they said and bring in my own take. you know.
wow, yes, I see. So yes, you've a dangerous game, isn't it? Because you don't know if they're spouting, should we say, nonsense.
No, you really don't. But I would always, and sometimes, yeah, people would look at me askance, like, what is she trying to say? And then I'm terrible. Like, here's where some of my dyslexia comes in. Terrible at remembering names, like really bad at, like, for example, for years, one of my favorite anthropologists is Zora Neale Hurston. And I was like, is it Hurston or Thurston? So I would just mumble it, because I didn't remember. So there's the big mumble, like I had the mumble for years. Like, oh, is that person's last name Thompson or Thomas? And I'd be like,
Yeah.
Thomas. You know? So my mumble hack is a good one.
Yeah.
Or sometimes, like even now, like I don't know if I was walking across the street and an older neighbor was in the middle of the street with her dog, and I said, let's trade places, because I had my dog and we didn't want our dogs to bark at each other. And I said, because for me it's less vicarious, and I meant to say precarious. And I didn't realize until I crossed the street, like I knew what word I wanted, but that's the one that popped out that was close enough. And I was like, oh, I meant precarious, but she was already gone. I was going to run after her and say, I really do know the word precarious. And I didn't mean vicarious.
Yeah, that's a different thing altogether.
Yeah, so things like that happen often. And I think I wasn't aware of the fact that that had anything to do with dyslexia until I had the diagnosis, and until, because I think so much of my dyslexia was what you would call stealth. But then who knows how much it was affecting me, or how much people looked at me and said, oh God, she has a terrible vocabulary, or what's she talking about? Because I wasn't aware. Most of the time, I probably wouldn't have been aware. It's vicarious instead of precarious, but I think I'm just more aware now, which is interesting.
Yes. Yeah, I think an awareness is a huge thing, isn't it? As you say, when your brain serves up the wrong word, it's I know what I mean. Hang on. Just give me a second.
I think that's why I like writing, because I am very verbal, and I wonder if maybe that's why there's so many writers with dyslexia, is because that's a place that we can sit down and we can really play with language, and we can write, and then we can correct it. We have that time and space to sit there and think, wait, was that the right word? Or, and you can play like Rodal, like you can just really play with words. And when you make a mistake, for me, like if I do a wrong word retrieval, it's sometimes interesting to me. And I think, oh, okay, like it's like a Freudian slip, or, and I think, okay, like what's going on with that? And I play with it. And I think that's another trait of dyslexia too, is just this wordplay. And I think that's why the, folks who have dyslexia and have been successful in writing, it's because I think we enjoy that. And I don't know, I'm just thinking of this now as I'm talking to you. It occurred to me that, sitting alone and writing is very forgiving. And it's a great way that we can play around with the gift without the embarrassment, or, like the pressure of having to do it immediately.
Yeah, it's really interesting point there, actually. I hadn't thought of it, because actually you get to play with words and it doesn't matter because you can read it afterwards, get it edited out. But I guess one advantage, actually, particularly if you're dealing with a narrative story, do you use your dyslexic brain to keep all the narrative in your head, all the individual plates in the narrative? And so you've got it in your mind. It's just getting it down onto a bit of page that's sticky.
It's beyond sticky. So I've been in Oslo, doing the field work for my next murder mystery, and it's so much fun. And so
Yeah.
first one, my protagonist has dyslexia and she has ADHD, and the first one was very much about her dyslexia and especially visual themes around her dyslexia. And this next book, I didn't know what it was going to be about. I went to Oslo and I was exploring, and I kept talking to musicians. And then I would meet people who are doing things on rhythm and attention. And so I thought, oh, this one is really going to be about attention and about sound. And I'm super
Um,
excited about it. And I have it all figured out in my head. And now I'm like, ugh. And I have like a million notes. I mean, like just to like show you how disastrous my
oh,
like,
blimey. Many, many post. Is that an envelope as well with stuff written on?
it's a postcard. It's a postcard. It's just like, and now it's like I'm home and I'm like gonna have to sit down and do this. you know
Yes,
It's
yes. Yeah,
like,
you'll have an
and
audience now who want to know what the next mystery is.
well, this is also where I think this whole AI debate is really interesting to me, because I haven't delved into playing around with AI yet. I will admit
Okay.
that. But I think, for those of us who are dyslexic thinkers, it's going to be wonderful, because we're going to continue doing all the crazy out there nonlinear thinking. And maybe we can get some AI bot to come in, help us put it all
Stick it all together
together.
somehow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll
Yeah.
just put in all the information and be like, plot,
Yeah.
murderer, blah, 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 get there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I like all of I love that. I think that's what I love about being a writer and anthropologist. I love the process. I love like going out there and talking to people and figuring things out. And then going from this, like, that's what's so much fun about anthropology, is you're just always going through rabbit holes. You're just, you talk to one person and suddenly you're thinking about something else, and then you find someone else to talk about on that topic, and you just kind of keep going. It's fun.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, one thing I suppose we haven't really got to anthropology. What's the kind of elevator pitch about it before we dive into why you wrote Whodunit about it?
Elevator pitch is that, again, I think, in this moment, we really need to understand human behavior. And it
Mhm.
is this great, very interdisciplinary field that at the core is about why humans do the things they do and how they do the things they do, and how that changes over time in some ways. So, I worked on Iran. That was my first field work. And I was basically looking at, like, how did the government go about creating Islamic citizens and the youngest citizenry, right? And the people who were born in 1979 at the revolution. And I got to I looked at textbooks and, peer groups and propaganda and television shows, and how do you create a national identity? And, so I think it's really interesting. And I have my window open, so maybe he can hear me, but my neighbor's an epidemiologist. So, like, for example, COVID, and he's a number cruncher. He's really good at that. I'm not. As I've said, I stink at numbers. So he would wake up in the morning during lockdown, and he would have all the World Health Organization numbers and make the projections of like where we're going with the pandemic. And then I would throw him a curveball and say, well, here we are in Orange County, California, and no one's wearing a mask. This is during the lockdown before we had
Yeah.
vaccines. And I said, so I think human behavior is going to mess up your numbers. Like, I
Yes.
think
Yeah.
we need to pay attention to this, or, oh, no, like, oh, suddenly we have people who aren't vaccinating. Well, that's going to also change your, prediction of where, like, what the death rates are going to be, or, those numbers are going to change based on human behavior. Same thing with climate change. Like, we can project, and, like, all of a sudden everyone's like, oh my God, it's closer than we thought. And we weren't projecting that it was going to be like right now that monkeys are falling out of trees in Mexico. And it's like, well, because human behavior over the 20 years that
Mm.
we've been predicting something has done something completely different. And
Yes.
so I think that's what's so exciting about anthropology, is we look at politics, we look at, climate science, we look at how all of these puzzle pieces fit together. And I think when anthropology is done well, it's very creative and brings in all of these things. And so I think it's a great field for people with dyslexia. And unfortunately, the way academia is set up is that a lot of people like me have a hard time even getting that far. I would not have gotten into Columbia University on my GRE scores. I'm a terrible test taker. It probably should have been another. And that was another thing actually that's really been gratifying in my diagnosis, is to know that it's not me, it's them. It's the test.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know? So, and I had mentors who saw my writing and believed in me, who saw my essays and were like, oh my God, Roxanne, you're a terrible speller, you need some help here on structure and grammar, but wow, like here's some really interesting thoughts, like the way that my mind work, and thought, there's some potential here, and ignored the tests. And if they hadn't done that, I wouldn't have gotten into grad school. I probably wouldn't have gotten into undergrad, because I just am a terrible test taker. But
Yeah.
I think differently. And so thank God for that essay component where I got to lay out how my mind works. And not everybody wants somebody who thinks differently, let me tell you. But
No,
yeah, and I
definitely
think
not.
this is
Yes.
a theme I hear throughout, like, with your podcasts and people that you've talked to, is, you find that one mentor, you find that one person who champions you and supports you and notices that you have a gift, inside all of that, like other stuff that's going on, and they're willing either to work with that or help you with that, or they think that you can somehow help yourself with that. I mean, I got my first publication as an academic was when I was in graduate school, so I think people kind of looked at this person who wasn't doing the reading for her grad seminars but was getting published. My book came out first in my cohort. So, so again, like this is, the dark horse thing type, it's like, oh, okay, how did that happen? Well, because I'm like silently at home doing the thing I do best, which is the writing that nobody sees, or I find best friends who were really helpful at editing my work. I always tell my students, because I teach the writing courses, and I say, if you find someone in here while we're doing peer-reviewed writing that gets you and can edit you, hold on to them for life.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Yep. Or know a lawyer. Lawyers are really good at proofreading.
Point, I hadn't thought about that. There you go. I haven't had to deal with
Yeah,
too many
everyone I
of
think proofread, give it to a legal professional.
those.
No, it's but that's really interesting, isn't it? You were struggling with some of the other stuff, but actually got your stuff published in a book first, which must have been exciting. Particularly a book. I mean, maybe this is my own personal bias, but books seem like this sort of mountain to me. I don't like reading them. Why would I ever want to write one and all this kind of stuff? So I'm always in awe of dyslexics who write books, which sounds like you got in there really, really early.
I just, from the time I was very young, and it's interesting too, because even as I was born in Iran and I lived through the revolution, and we left Iran when I was 8, and I went back to do field work and to live with the family and relearn Persian. So my journals were there from when I was like 6 or 7, and I was a mirror writer. I did the backwards B's and D's. And I remember mentioning that to my mother when I first saw the journals. And she said, oh, most children are mirror writers, which, the jury's out on that, I guess. I don't know. But I was definitely reversing things. And my son had so much trouble with C's and B's and D's. Early on. And I definitely have dysgraphia. There's no question about that. And I tell my students now, if I write on the whiteboard, I'll say, you probably won't be able to read this, and no one can read this. But yeah, I was an early journaler. Like I kept journals forever. It was my way of like getting things out. And now with assistive technology, and my son is so much like me, except that again, I think his dyslexia is at a much more intense level, but he is in this day and age where assistive technology is so present. So he's constantly on his iPhone taking notes. He's really into Dungeons and Dragons and wants to write campaigns. And so he's just able to dictate all of that, so it's just a matter of the way I look at it is it's technology. Handwriting is technology, getting, things down. But it's like what happens up here is just a different thing, it's just a matter of, like you said, just getting it from here to here. And how do we do that? And now it's a lot easier, I think, with assistive technology, except I just came back from Oslo with like 100 notes on my iPhone and to transfer them all and do something with them. So that is the harder part, is the structure and all of that.
Definitely. So on to Death in a Nutshell, which is the first book in your series of Armchair Anthropology. Now, we always said the idea about behind it was getting people interested in it, but why did you write a Whodunit? And is it something you love reading as a genre and thought, actually, I'm going to try and write one of these and put the anthropology in later? Or how did you kind of come around to doing it? And how does it work?
Yeah, so I don't know how it works, but no, I love murder mysteries, always have, especially whodunits, because I love puzzling things out, and I love trying to figure things out. And anthropology, in a lot of way, is like being a detective. You're walking around trying to figure things out. And so it felt natural that an anthropologist would be a detective, but that's not how it started. It started just because my son's really into paleontology. We were in Bozeman, Montana, on a family vacation at the Museum of the Rockies, and we were in the Maiasaura exhibit, and suddenly it just came to me, this idea for this murder mystery that would happen in Yellowstone. And then we left, and then I wrote it down literally on a receipt on the airplane. Maybe it was a baggage tag, I don't know. And then I got home, I had like some virus, that was the end of our winter vacation. I had to go back to teaching. So it kind of just stayed there. And I think I might have written like the first 20 pages for fun at some point, and then I left it. And then the pandemic happened, and I picked it up again and just decided to write 1,000 words a day and just see what would happen. And as I was writing, I remembered the Maiasaura exhibit, and I looked up, who's the paleontologist, and it was this guy named Jack Horner. I had no idea who he was, but I thought that he'd be a fun character, so I just put him in there. I didn't know that like Steven Spielberg had already done that. It was like, whatever. And then, I wanted my protagonist to have dyslexia because I just have a hard time taking off my educator's cap. And I just wanted to put in all this information and knowledge that I had learned about dyslexia over the years. And I wanted a character, my son enjoyed watching, not reading so much, the Hank Zipser series. And I wanted somebody who was older, who has dyslexia, who's in graduate school, to show that this is possible. And she struggles, but she also has these great strengths. And so I thought that would be fun. And then I just continued writing it. And I thought, you know what? My second book on Iran is about underground theater. And I'd put all my field notes, all of my theory, into these director's notes. And I thought, you know what? I'll just do that with her, and I'll have all her ethnography. And then I can teach like an entire quarter of visual anthropology in one book. And I'll just do that. So I started experimenting with that. And then my son, this was before the pandemic. My son started going to this program called Eye to Eye, which was founded by Jonathan Mooney. And I didn't realize it was for high school kids. And I think at the time he might have been 12. But he went, and he came home one day and he's like, "Where are my fossils? I gotta have my fossils." And I said, "What's going on?" He said, our mentor is a paleontologist." And I was like, "Oh, cool." And I said, "Who's your mentor?" And he said, "This guy named Jack Horner." And I was like, "What?" I was like, "What's he doing in California? He's supposed to be in Bozeman." And I was like, well, "Is he dyslexic?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I was like, "How did I miss that?" So I went the next week and I said, "Hey, Jack, I've been writing this murder mystery and you're a character." And he was so cool. He was like, "If this is if this is like to help, people with dyslexia, then I'm all for it. And when it was finished, I went and read him the parts that he was in, and he corrected one thing, and that was pretty much it. And then he approved, and that was great. He's wonderful. And so that was like this weird moment of synchronicity, where these puzzle pieces fell together, and I felt like, oh, this is good. Like, I'm on track here. But I did, those were my training wheels. That first book is my training wheels. Like, I think the second book will be way more streamlined. It's not going to be long, it's based on all this original research I did in Oslo. So I'm really excited about the first book too, because I think it has a lot of, going back to your question about why anthropology and what's the elevator pitch, I think especially visual anthropology is something that everyone should know something about. We all use PowerPoints. We often use them incorrectly. We put stuff up that ends up being offensive to people. We take for granted when we use memes and visuals and things like that. So I think it's not bad for the general public to learn a little bit about visual theory. And I try to do it in such a way that maybe people will become interested and want to go into this field, or take some of what works for them. And, so yeah. And the whodunit's just fun, but it's also like, I don't know, maybe you'll relate to this as well. I think it's this whole multi-potentiality or whatever. I'm just constantly jumping from one thing to the next. And once I learn something, then because I also write plays, and like every time you go into a new genre, you really have to learn that genre. And then you also are in a whole new kind of like peer group. So when I was doing theater, I loved the collaboration. I love that collaborative aspect, and it is oral. So you're not doing all this heavy reading. You're just listening and interacting. And I just love theater. And I can see why so many people with dyslexia are in the theater world, because it's just the most gratifying way to enter into language. Love that. And it's the same thing with the murder mystery. I'm in Sisters in Crime, and I have a mentor, and she's like the head of the Scottish crime. And she's just wonderful, and I have so much to learn from her. And I love that. I love, there's such a forgiving and kind group of people. So this is me coming out of 20 years of academia, right? And I'm like, oh, these people who want to like be in conversation and aren't hyper competitive, or maybe that's outside, and are collaborative, and it's nice, it's not achievement. I love that. And, I think my household for the past 15 years, since we've been homeschooling and had to do things differently and have had to let go of like what normal looks like, has been incredibly liberating for everyone. I think I've been fighting it like this whole time. I've been boxing within like a cage, and I feel like we opened up the door, and now I'm like, ooh, I can come out. So yeah. And I think that's what a diagnosis does sometimes, is it kind of opens the door, right? And it gives us permission. And it's not like I haven't said anything at work. I haven't asked for anything in terms of assistive technology or anything. I've been doing that all along, but I'm just really, and I've always been a disability ally with my students, but I'm just way more open with them too about, if I misspell something, and I'll tell them I can't do I and E. To this day, I get I and E mixed up, or E and I, or whatever. And I just told them, I said, you can't count on me for spelling. If I put something up, just assume it's wrong. This is a component of my dyslexia, or, this is a component of my dysgraphia. And then I just kind of normalize it for them. I'm somebody who's gotten this far in education and at a research university, in the professorship, and I'm still misspelling things, and that's okay. It shouldn't hold you back,
No, that's really cool. And it's really interesting. It was interesting to see where the book series goes, and see how many people are anthropologists, or whether you get a load of audience from somewhere else you never even thought of.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's fine. And and the thing that's fun too with the series is exactly that. You can kind of I'm hoping for this audience that I can somewhat interact with and take from and put into the next books. So like
Yes.
I taught it in my multimodal anthropology class, and I asked them, who's your favorite character, or who do you want to see in the next book, or what do you want more of or less of? Everyone loves the field notes, which I said in the foreword, you can skip if you want to. And people were like, why would we ever skip those? They're our favorite part. So it's interesting. And then also she learns more about her dyslexia and her
Yeah.
ADHD. And we're still learning more neurologically about, this. So I can continue to update, as the field itself updates,
Yeah.
which is fun.
Yeah, most definitely. Right. So I'm going to start winding the podcast up now. But before you leave, every guest that comes on the show gets 3 rapid fire questions from me. They don't necessarily need rapid fire answers for you, but they're just some interesting points we can talk through. So let's fire into question number 1. What prejudice have you had about dyslexia that's been proven wrong?
Well, one, that people with dyslexia cannot rhyme. That was a huge one. And that held me back from maybe getting my son diagnosed sooner, because he was so good at finishing the end of Dr. Seuss books. I would read them to him once and he would remember the rhymes, and we're both really into poetry. So that was a huge one.
Yeah.
Honestly, I didn't have a lot of prejudices because it wasn't even in my lexicon. Like I didn't know, I knew so little about it.
Yeah.
Nobody around me ever was out as dyslexic. So it's interesting. I didn't really have a lot of prejudices except for the rhyming. And I don't know where I got that from. It's kind of, my dad wrote poetry too.
Yeah, that's not one I've heard of before about the rhyming.
There you go, a new one to add to that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay, rapid fire question number 2. If an alien landed and you had to describe dyslexia to them, how would you do it?
I would say somebody who is an out of the box, non-linear thinker who loves to put puzzle pieces together and is an explorer. Somebody who likes to go out into the world and talk to people and find things and figure out how they work, and isn't afraid to make mistakes until society comes and pounds them on the head from
Yes.
and that's
Yeah,
how
I agree.
we innovate. And I would say, if you want to find somebody to help you understand the human race, go find someone with dyslexia, alien.
Right. And final question is rapid fire set. And seeing as this is the Dyslexia Life Hacks Show, what is your favorite dyslexia life hack?
Again, I think, having that space to make mistakes and write things up ahead of time. I read somewhere that introverts, and I do think of myself as an introvert a little bit, though I'm not shy, spend a lot of time preparing. And I think it's the same, I think, with a lot of folks with dyslexia, is to just take your time. I think I mean, you just rapid fired at me, but I think one of the things that I think is okay to do in the world is to pause. And I think that's, again, my hack is writing, because I can edit. Not that I ever edit my text when I'm, dictating. Sounds like.
Yeah.
And the other one I've been doing, which I don't think is, I know, like with hack, I mean, that would be a good thing, right? Not a bad thing. Like I said, I mumble. So,
Yeah.
not really a hack.
Shaky ground to that one.
Again, but I think that's it, really, is just being really super prepared ahead of time. I usually am, and also I think the other hack is just, and I think it's, I don't think it's, I think it's something that comes naturally, but just really putting out the question that's in my mind at any moment, and that usually really trips people up and puts everything on a different footing, like just to ask a question that's on my mind, the right question. But to ask lots of questions, my husband's always like, oh my God, and my son says, oh, Mom, you're so nosy. But then I say, I'm an anthropologist. It's an excuse for being nosy. So I think asking a lot of questions has always been my hack. So if things get a little, difficult or uncomfortable or whatever, I just think of really fun questions.
Sounds like a cool idea to me. Right. Before we sign off, where can people find you? And is there anything else you'd like to add?
I am at roxannevarzi.com. So that's pretty easy. And I think what I'd like to add really is just that I think the most important thing is to embrace who you are. Follow your bliss, as Joseph Campbell said, and embrace who you are. And I'm really glad that even before my diagnosis, or knowing that what I was doing was being done because of the way that my brain is wired, I just went ahead and did it anyway. I didn't let
Yes. Yeah.
it's painful, and there were moments where my feelings were deeply hurt, or I didn't get promoted or the job or whatever, but I just kept doing my thing. I just kept doing it, because if you find something that you are really passionate about, whether it's playing Dungeons and Dragons or writing in your journal or whatever, you just keep doing it. And I remember someone said to me once, just keep writing in your journal. It doesn't have to be published immediately. Just do what you feel
Yeah.
passionate about, and don't let, everything else bring that down. That's my
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, most definitely. Well, that just leads me to thank you, Roxanne, for taking the time to come on the show and talk to me. It's been really, really interesting getting to know you.
Well, I have a million questions for you, Matthew. So when I start my podcast, be ready.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'll be ready. And I want to thank everybody else for taking the time to listen, and I'll speak to you in the next episode. Goodbye for now.